Hello everybody, welcome to PAX Aus Online 2021. My name is Adrian Webb, I'm the Manager of Virtual Worlds at the Department of Defence, and I'm here to moderate the panel Games in Defence, Decision Support, Not Just an FPS. I have a range of people from the Department of Defence here with me, but first of all I'd like to just do the usual formalities. Firstly, an acknowledgement of country. Defence acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. Defence recognises their continuing connection to traditional lands and waters and would like to pay respect to their elders both past and present. Defence would also like to pay respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women who have contributed to the defence of Australia in times of peace and war. Another formality is the disclaimer that the materials and views discussed today are provided for general information only and on the understanding that the Australian Government and Department of Defence is not providing professional advice on a particular matter or indicate a commitment to a particular course of action. Any companies or products mentioned today do not constitute endorsement of the materials or any associated organisation, product or services. The views expressed today are entirely of the maker's own choice and not of the Department of Defence. All right. So in that, I'll introduce today's panel. So like I said, my name's Adrian Webb, Manager of Virtual Worlds. I look after new and emerging technologies within Defence and promote their aspects, specifically around VR, AR and serious games. With me, I have Andrew Guy, Todd Mason, Josh Foster and Darren Huxley, and I'll get them to introduce themselves, starting off with Andrew.
Thank you, Adrian. So as Adrian said, my name's Andrew Guy and I work at the Australian Defence College. So I'm a senior developer here. Uh, I've worked in the Department of Defence for more than 20 years now as a public servant in various software development roles. So my work for the Australian Defence College is in the education and training domain. And the mission for the centre that I work for is to provide virtual and constructive simulation in support of joint education and training across both the college and the wider defence community. Uh, my skills are in the C++ and C# development areas. Nowadays, mainly developing in Unity, although I have got experience in other gaming engines like Unreal and coding simulation systems directly in C and C#. Um, I'm part of a small team that's a combination of APS staff, contractors, and military reservists. I've also worked in commercial IT in environments prior to defence for over 10 years, so I've seen, I guess, both sides, and I am degree qualified in software development and engineering, which is kind of an expectation in defence for senior developers at this sort of level. So that's a brief on who I am.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'll go next to Todd.
Yeah, g'day, Adrian. So my name is Todd Mason. I work for the Defence Science and Technology Group, and our role is to provide scientific and research advice to Defence and to other parts of government. I work in the Joint Operations and Analysis Division in the Strategy and Joint Force branch. And specifically, I'm in the Strategic Wargaming and Experimentation Cell. My background is that I've worked in the simulation world for around about 30 years in defence, health and emergency management. And I've developed computer simulations and manual war games for both training and experimentation for all of that time.
Alrighty. Thank you very much, Todd. Josh, you're up.
Hi, Adrian. My name is Sergeant Joshua Foster. I'm a battlespace communications specialist at the Defence Force School of Signals under the Defence Command Support Training Centre, and I teach the battle management system to our trainees and our officers for use in their roles as battlespace communicators. I'm also the president of the ADF RPG Association, where I promote the use of tabletop RPGs such as Dungeons and Dragons as a way for people to explore different methods and undergo training and experience using the safety net of a tabletop war game.
And Josh, just for the audience, can you explain a little bit about the battle management system and what that particularly is used for within defence?
Yeah, I can. So the battle management system is a networked system that allows for the passing of information between different nodes within a formation or a battle group, so that the commander can see the geographical disposition of those units and make decisions in a timely fashion to control the battle.
Nice one. Thank you very much. And last but not least, we've got Darren. Darren, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, Adrian. Thanks a lot for that. I'm Darren Huxley. I work in our strategic policy division in the Department of Defence. I'm the director of Wargaming and Exercises. And that probably title supports the fact that I'm not purely related to wargaming. There are other things in our area. So one of the main functions I do is generate opportunities for senior leadership within defence or policy makers to get together to do what we would call forecasting events, where we try and have a bit of a look at the future, what might happen there, and we use wargaming and other exercise tools to generate the scenarios, the environment, the context in which people can immerse themselves to think through problem sets so that eventually we can adjust our strategic policy settings should that be necessary. My background in that is I spent 30 years in the Army. In that, I did a lot of training around strategy and planning. So I'm quite familiar with Defence's planning systems and the way Defence thinks. So I apply that to the existing frameworks of policy and say, hey, how can we gamify it to a certain degree to get a different outcome than a logical planning methodology?
Nice one. Thank you very much, Darren. All right, so I'll jump straight into some questions and we'll see what the panel can answer. So question one, how are you utilizing games-based technologies or practices within your various areas? And we'll start off with Todd this time.
Okay, so more broadly, DSTG has a number of teams that will use game-related technologies, both manual and computerized. There's dozens of simulations in use across defence, let alone in DSTG. And there's also, activities such as development of artificial intelligence, particularly for supporting decision-making and essentially playing games. And there's a high-performance computing lab and so on. So there's quite a lot of those things across DSTG. In my particular area, essentially we're two teams that are kind of related. So we do have a small simulation team, and they use products such as Command PE, which is the sort of professional version of a commercial game called Command, which is published by Matrix Games. And then we also have a military simulation called ASSIM, which is developed by the US Air Force. And then we're looking at trying to use JSAF as well, which you would know more about than I would. But in my specific area, we're also using manual war games. So we do a lot of experiments that are essentially aimed at eliciting sort of subject matter expert knowledge about perhaps future operations or future force structures and so on. And we find that manual methods allow us to design bespoke experiments to suit the specific questions that we're being asked. That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Todd. Andrew, if you want to have a chat about some of the work that you're doing within the game space.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we're certainly, I guess, game-based technology is our bread and butter of the simulation technologies that we deliver to our clients. And I'll just run through a couple of the areas that we're developing into. So we've got the Avatar Augmented Roleplay system. So I'm actually broadcasting today from our actor room. So you'll see in the background our mannequin, which is all instrumented up for the actor role. Obviously, the real humans normally doing that. So the ARP system allows an instructor to act as effectively a digital puppet. So their voice, face, and body movements are translated onto a relevant avatar. So that allows them to take on alternate genders, alternate ethnicities, and alternate ages for role-playing activities where we simply don't have that type of character available in real life. So that's used in our Peace Operations Training Centre for cultural empathy, negotiation and intel training, and in our Defence Force School of Languages down in Melbourne for language training to give an operational context to their training. We've also got our virtual vehicle patrol system, which uses is being ported across to the Unity platform. So that's a current project we're working on. So that system is used for UN military observer training and runs through about 15 peace operation scenarios, things like freedom of movement, human rights abuse, personal safety, and doing observations. And as I said, we're moving that across from a military simulation across to the Unity game platform. That's allowing us to upgrade the scenarios, provide more suitable terrain, and improve the vehicle physics and the terrain. We've also got the Enhanced Capability Handbook. So this is a recently delivered project that we've done, which is creating an iPad and a web-based version of the Defence Force Capability Handbook. So this is a document that details each of the major platforms in use in the ADF. And at the moment, that's a PDF document with some pictures and tables and descriptions of each of those platforms. So we've enhanced that to have embedded 3D models and videos of each of the platforms, so that it's basically enhancing and bringing that fairly mundane PDF alive to the audience. The final one that I'll cover just quickly is the escape room project that we're working on at the moment. So this is a language task project. So this will be using a VR headset to explore a room using the escape room concept. So finding clues, resolving the clues with language skills, and then eventually, getting a code that you can actually exit the room. So this is really, we're gamifying this by limiting the time to escape and having a score that based on the skills that they use to solve the language puzzles. So that's an example of the types of gaming-based technologies that we're using in our area.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
There is.
And we'll go from lots of digital to a bit more analog. Darren, do you want to explain a little bit more about how you guys are using games-based concepts and practices within your areas for strategic?
Yeah, so we feel pretty inadequate because digitalization is not where we're at. I suppose that the background behind strategic level conversations about the future and what might happen is that we're almost in that old school choose your own adventure platform where we give you a scenario and you assume your particular character and we ask questions about the scenario. So that's where most of strategic gaming has been. Scenario, bunch of questions in which you identify what you might like to do. What we're trying to do is expand that. So as Todd mentioned, both in his work and ours as well, we use a lot of matrix games, if we can, to try and introduce that level of randomness or chance into the outcome. In the choose your own adventure, in most cases, it's either you go left or you go right, and the decision's pretty black or white. Same in our conversations at the moment. What we want to try and do is introduce some randomness to it, a bit of difficulty, so that people have to think a bit harder beyond left and right in terms of their choices. We're also trying to get into, I wouldn't say commercial board games, but the board gaming arena. Like Todd, we find that at the strategic level, the time we can devote to gaming events is very short. So we need tools that support a 30-minute to an hour and a half style game. We can't have a 3 or 4 day board game that just goes on forever. So we're looking at various tools in the board game realm that help us think about the future, help us project a context for our senior leaders to have a conversation about what they might do, and then again introduce that element of randomness and difficulty to ensure that not every choice they make is necessarily successful. Because we find a lot of the learning benefit comes when the people engaged in the conversation can't do what they think they should be able to do. So we're looking for games on that. So bottom line, at the strategic level, we're very old school RPG and old school, very basic board gaming.
Oh, that's great. And I guess this is the thing we wanted to showcase, that it's as much as everyone thinks of when they think of defense and they think of games, they can think of the VR headsets and other engines online and on the computers, that there is a whole lot of analog aspects that we can do as well. And especially in that wargaming space, you know, doing that, the board games, they're just as important part to help us within defense in making some of those important decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, we'll probably touch on it a bit later, but one of the problems we have at the strategic level, you're talking geopolitics, and the variables available to select from are enormous, which again, you know, if you've ever played a multiplayer massive online game, the number of variables and the constant upgrades to the software involved behind it is significant. One, we can't afford that. And two, we don't have the time or the dedicated resources to maintain a world sim where we can have conversations. So we need to have that old school, cheap, easy, and flexible design systems.
Thank you, Darren. Josh, now obviously you just recently won an award for some of the work that you've been doing. Do you want to explain that and expand a bit more about how you're using game techniques for your teaching the battle management system?
Yeah, Adrian. So I won the Army Award for Instructional Excellence earlier this year for my work that I did in 2020, where I took our battle management system product and laid over an RPG essentially. So the system itself provides for, as I mentioned before, the command and control of the battle space through a software system. Now, this software system resembles an interactive map and unit icons for the commander to see and for units to share information with each other. Now, I just overlaid a simple war game where each person takes on the role of a various vehicle within the system, and built around that a simple dice rolling effect that as they made decisions in the software, the outcomes were randomized based on the decisions they made. So for example, if they use their terrain analysis to find a high feature, they would move to that feature. I would then look at the system and look at the enemy picture, and then just like a game of Dungeons and Dragons, when you crest the top of the hill, you see an enemy BMP at this grid. What are you going to do? And the students would then make tactical decisions, and then I would use basically an Excel spreadsheet that I'd made up to save me rolling 1,000 dice, and then the outcome would generate. They would then go through their processes like sending combat reports and returns, and that was the way that we taught the course. The way the course was originally taught was death by PowerPoint structure, where we would bring up a slide which told them which button to click, and they would then all click that button, and then they would progress through the training over a couple of days. Whereas by using the active blended learning method that I developed, we would just play the game for a day and a half. And when it came time to give them their summative assessment, by playing the game, they'd interacted with the system so much organically that we had 100% pass rate on the summative assessments. And after I think about 3 or 4 trials, this became the teaching method that we used because of the positive feedback from the students, such as, you know, I didn't feel like I was in a classroom. I was enjoying myself so much. Often at lunchtime, it came to the point where I was telling them to go to lunch because the game, it pauses. You can step away from the game and you can go and have lunch and come back later. And that was the level of engagement that students had, which was a real positive for me, and a real positive for the students. So that's the stuff that I've been doing recently.
Yeah, and I guess that gets into the next question about seeing the results of the tradition versus the traditional method. So the games-based methods versus the traditional methods. Andrew, given you're doing a lot of work with the schools, how have you seen that aspect and those results versus the traditional way you used to do things versus the ways that you're introducing now?
Sure. Um, I guess where we see the maximum results is we really look at three areas where simulation has the most effect, and that's usually where it's enhancing capabilities, reducing risks, and saving resources. So I guess when we get that combination of all three of those is where we do see those maximum results. And good examples of where we see those is in our ARP system. Um, because we can't do things like get real world child soldiers or women in distress and put them in as actors, obviously, for very good ethical reasons, but we can get subject matter experts who are available and put them in the suit and then transform them digitally into those characters. Um, we we're reducing the risks, saving resources, and therefore enhancing our capability. And we see, the maximum return there. And we've got, lots of real world examples where we see this training go out there, and the feedback from the students is, we would not have seen that unless we experienced it in the simulation, other than, the first time that happened in the real world, which is obviously, you know, not the ideal time to be learning those type of lessons. Um, in our virtual vehicle patrol, we're able to have dangerous situations that aren't reproducible in the field, so we can, do things like mines, live fire, vehicle accidents, all the types of things that even when you're doing a field exercise, you simply can't reproduce those because, it's too risky. Um, and again, in our enhanced capability handbook, by visualizing the platforms, um, we're making available platforms that aren't readily accessible during courses, so the students aren't able to go out and actually, see, um, you know, the LHD, or go out and see a JSF, because those platforms simply just aren't available at the drop of a hat to be able to go out and look at. So by having them there as 3D models, they're able to still get that visualization. And yeah, going it that way. So we also do surveys of our students on each of the courses that we run the simulation on, um, because it's important to, I guess, not to overreach as well. We can always be trying to strive to get, too much realism, and there is a point at which, and we do this by looking at our surveys, determine that we have enough realism. So we're measuring things like, value engagement versus realism um, from the students, to see at which point, do we have enough engagement and enough realism, or do we need to continue to chase that? Because there's obviously a continued cost in doing that. And by doing the surveys across each course, we're able to see that, because the students' expectations also change over time. We're finding, particularly as the younger cohorts move through, their expectations as a generation of gamers is much higher than the older generations of cohorts that we've had previously. So we do need to continue to improve the technology so that we don't lose that level of realism for that newer generation.
Thank you, Andrew. Todd, I'll ask you about some of, once you've seen that engagement, how are you utilizing the results of those engagements to better inform defence, especially in, because wargaming's been around for a while. How are you using those to better inform defence?
Yeah, so in the analytical setting, it's quite different to that training setting that's just been described. Whilst presumably the participants do learn something from what they're doing, the learners are actually the analysts and the observers that are watching what happens and taking note. So the reason why we would use essentially a game of some sort is because it allows us to observe those players making the decisions in that competitive environment. So a classroom isn't necessarily always competitive. I think some of the games that people have described are, but it's not always. And so when the players know that they're playing against an intelligent, thinking opponent who's actively trying to win, trying to beat them, that's a different motivation for those participants than just a standard planning exercise that you might do in a class. So that allows us to do that. And essentially, we treat this as an experimental environment. It's kind of like a laboratory. It's very hard to go out into the field. It's even harder to go out into actual operations to make these observations. So we try to use analysis in that sort of observational mode to see how and why people are making decisions, what their perception of this simulated world is. So what information they have, how they've synthesized that, how they've put it together, and then how that affects their plans. Specifically then how we might draw that information out kind of depends on the experiment and the activity. So again, where we use computer simulation, there'd be a lot of data logging and so on occurring, but we're particularly interested in the manual games, and therefore a lot of our observations are based on analysts observing decision making and asking the occasional question of, why did you make that decision, or what are you thinking now? And that's all sort of tracked to help us analyse what decisions were being made, and more importantly, why they were being made the way they were being made.
Darren, as someone else who's doing wargaming, do you have anything else to add for that? The results of your wargames and how they help shape defence?
I think, a couple of reflections just quickly, on Andrew's one. We find it really interesting. Obviously, I deal with probably a slightly older cohort of defence, more senior officers. But the idea that a simulation constantly has to keep up with today's technology. But you take chess, a chessboard is, a couple of thousand years old, and no one quibbles when you bring out an old bone chessboard to have a game. But you play a game on a simulation and everyone complains about the digital stuff. In my end of the spectrum, part of that problem is getting beyond the conversation. So if you take a simulation, people start, I suppose, tearing apart the quality of the graphics or the quality of the decision-making, whatever it might be. Whereas if you have a paper one, everyone knows it's pretty obvious that it's cheap and nasty and it's simple. And so they don't worry so much about the simplicity. It takes that away. So I think that's an important cognitive component of wargaming at different levels. If, depending on your audience, they may or may not like the particular device you're using. In terms of the response of our people to gaming, traditionally the conversation, scenario-based Q&A style we have, but everyone gets to say one or two things. That tends to be quite stilted in the conversation. Gaming allows us to go, and then what? So we get that further development. Like Todd, I'm in that analytical space where I'm trying to understand why we're making decisions, why people choose one path over another, what was the stimulus to it. A game allows us to keep going further and further into, and then what, and then what, and then what. That's really good from our data capture point of view, because the more information we have about why you're making these decisions and what's prompting them, the better our outcomes will be. So in terms of gaming, people really enjoy that, but we do have that complexity between, not the complexity, the requirement for abstraction to be at a level that's acceptable to the audience. Not too simple, but not too complex. Finding that medium is a challenge.
Yes, finding that balance is a very big challenge. Let me just reiterate again, just to remind everybody that obviously the views expressed here are everyone's own personal views and not those specifically of defence unless specifically stated. So I'll just go on to the next question that we've got about what makes wargaming different to simulation. If I can throw back to you, Darren, as someone who's doing that wargaming in that higher level, why would you define simulation different to wargaming, or would you class them as the same thing?
So yeah, from a technical point of view, I would class them as the same thing. I think from a layman's kind of approach to it, wargaming is definitely competitive. So we're seeking to have an adaptive thinking competition where two or more groups are in fact competing over a particular outcome, whether it be victory, whether it be something else, doesn't really matter. It's very much competition based. I think you can have a simulation that doesn't have a competition. It's just replicating something that we see in the real world. So from our point of view, simulations are nice in terms of the stuff they can do, but we're very interested in the competition aspects rather than the replication of the real world.
Okay, and Todd, do you have anything to add to that about simulation versus wargaming?
No, pretty much I agree with that. I mean, all war games are some form of simulation. They're simulating something in the real world or an imaginary world. But the thing that differentiates them is that decision making and the ability to influence that virtual world, whatever it happens to be.
And would I be right in saying when it comes to wargaming, it's not just the two people that are playing, but it's also other people around, like you were talking about the analytics aspects, the other people that are around the table watching those people play as well, or?
Oh, there's certainly in the professional sort of settings that we use, there's usually dozens of people. So yes, there are potentially adjudicators, there are analysts, there might be some subject matter experts or mentors or those sorts of things. There might even be some people providing advice to the decision makers. There's probably other supporting tools as well. They would certainly have reference material, but it might even be a battle management system or something. So it would depend entirely on the situation. But yeah, they're usually for the sorts of things that we would do. There's usually a pretty big cast of people.
Darren, you're working with pretty high-level people within defence when you're doing your wargaming. Do you obviously see that cast of people around as well?
Surprisingly or not, we tend to have very closed rooms. A lot of our games are classified. So the number of people in the room tends to be smaller than you would think. But before we go into that environment, each of the players is briefed and has support from all of their staffs. So there's a lot of people who get access to the material, who get access to the ideas we're presenting to brief the principal players. But when they get in the room, in some cases, it's up to them to make the decisions for whatever their particular area is. Having said that, yeah, I have seen games where you literally have 3 rows deep of supporting staff for the principal player.
Wow. A lot of research and homework, in essence, before you play the game, Darren.
Yeah, absolutely. And hence why, we try and keep it as simplistic as we can, because the multitude of players generally across our organisation means that you can't tailor the game for one specific area of defence. It's got to have the ability to have an input from multiple players. So in that sense, I suppose, we are playing multiplayer games rather than just your standard two-sided war game. It is a multiplayer war game based mostly on the way defence is constructed, that everybody has an input into solving the problems or understanding the context that we're having the conversation about.
And so, Darren, you look at that high level and that strategy aspect, but then we go to Josh, who's also using aspects of wargaming, but like you said, for a very specific aspect in the battle management system. Josh, do you want to explain a bit more about how you're using those tools and those kind of areas and incorporating them into the training?
Yeah, so just to touch on what was previously mentioned about context, we found that the context that the game provides is invaluable. Prior to implementing the BMS active blended learning environment system, you're talking about maneuver warfare, communications requirements, logistics chains to junior soldiers who have no idea what is even involved in these processes. But by turning it into a game and giving them control of their avatars, acting like the commander in the room, getting them to make their own decisions and justify their decisions using the tools available to them. I had cavalrymen that have transferred over to SIGs, and they're sitting in the classroom. They've been exposed to maneuver warfare all through their careers and participated in it. But it wasn't until they sat down with the ABLE system and looked at it from a commander's perspective, with the freedom that playing the game actually gave them, that they actually truly understood what they were doing all those years where they were driving their armored vehicles around. And so that was really rewarding for me, but also really rewarding for the students. To get that bird's eye view understanding of the system that they are, at this stage in their careers, are more towards the bottom, looking up, not understanding the big picture. It gave them that, and now they can go forward in their careers. It reminds me of when I went on my promotion courses for sergeant, going from corporal to sergeant. A lot of my fellow corporals had dealt in their particular job in their particular fields, and then all of a sudden we're thrust into this world of, you're now the platoon commander, make some decisions about where you're going to send your troops. And the whole concept to 50% of the course was so foreign that we had to do additional training just to get them to a base level standard, which hopefully, through use of serious gaming, whether it's simulation, whether it's tabletop war gaming, and just getting those concepts out there and just rounding off everyone's understanding, I think that's a big leap forward in a lot of the training that we do down here.
And are you seeing your usage of this work expanding, Josh? Like, are you aiming to create other programs using it as well, or?
Yeah, so looking at the senior leadership now, a lot of them have played games. Like, the old guard is leaving, and the newly promoted senior officers have experienced games in the past. And me, for myself, I can sit here now and probably rattle off how much it costs to buy a tank in Command and Conquer. But if we can take that learning ability that occurs in a game, put the veneer of, hey, this is actual realistic information, and give it to people as a game, there's no reason why they can't have the same level of understanding and retention of knowledge that I have about my favorite games. And that's where I think we can make some real games, not just for learning, but also, as touched on previously, exposing people to scenarios that you would have to go to a war zone to experience, and having that front loaded with you and having that knowledge already in a safe environment gives you the confidence in that actual environment to do what you need to do in those harsh situations. So I think it's an amazing tool that, and I'm glad to see that there's other areas that are really pushing the envelope in this space, which is great to see.
And what about yourself, Andrew? From a more technical aspect, how are you? Like, what future projects are you working along at this moment?
Yeah, I guess more immersiveness is something that we're definitely trying to pursue, and I guess that's really pushing us into the augmented reality area, particularly with devices like the HoloLens. So really, with our avatar system, trying to get not just the avatar on a screen, but actually get them in the room with the people. Because we're dealing with human interactions, that level of immersion is important. The more realistic we can make it, the more that those lessons can be learnt. Also doing things like, at the moment, we're limited to a single actor. There's scenarios where we're going to need multiple actors, and also importantly, easier generation of the avatars. So at the moment, we've got a set of about 25 avatars that were relatively expensive to produce, using real world people, capturing, with cameras. There are newer technologies now that use AI to actually generate avatars, and we're looking at to exploit that type of technology to allow rapid generation of the avatars.
Nice one. So we've got about 10 to 15 minutes left, so we've got a couple more questions. And we'll start with Todd. How do you see the future of defence and its usage of these emerging technologies? From your own perspective, not defence's specific.
Yeah, look, my answer is really just one sentence. I think it's rosy, but I've always seen it as rosy. I think there's both a lot of opportunity, and that opportunity will just keep increasing. And I think defence overall is pretty willing to explore some of these things. There's obviously obstacles along the way, and there are various reasons for those things. But I just don't see. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't see an alternative. We have to create those virtual experiences that we just talked about in order to prepare people to go into all sorts of weird and wacky situations. And we could really only do that via some sort of synthetic means. So, yeah, I just see it expanding, exponentially.
Thanks, Todd. What about yourself, Josh? Do you have anything? How do you see the future of defence and using these technologies?
Well, with the cyber threat as it exists in the world, and me for my job explaining the invisible light that comes out of your radio that allows you to communicate, it can be very difficult for people that don't have a baseline understanding of that technology. I envisage using systems that make the invisible visible. A lot of the complaints that I have with my job in enabling communications is working with maneuver warfare operators their primary job is fighting the battle, moving the vehicles, moving the troops, and signals and communications is kind of something that kind of happens in the background, much like logistics. So if we can make a system or a simulation which shows the radio telecommunications that occurs across the battlefield, how that enhances the commander's ability to do his job, the importance that it plays in coordinating troops and getting information on enemy movements to the commander as soon as possible so he can make a decision. I think that's the direction that we can go to holistically round off a lot of the training rather than just focusing on our key area. And I think that's I'm looking forward to the next 10 years when this stuff gets developed and pushed out as regular training.
Darren, do you have anything to add about you seeing the usage of emerging technologies and practices, of course, because like you said, it's not just about the technology itself in your area?
Yeah, no, I think, I'm incredibly optimistic, just like Todd, and I think Josh is. I think the key thing to remember is we are no different to the technological evolution that the rest of the planet is going through. We come from an organization, particularly in defense. Defense is a human resource organization. We implicitly trust human judgment in almost all things. Transitioning that to trusting technology is an interesting aspect of our work. How do you assure that the computer is making the decision that a human would make? At the moment, we're seeing it in cars, I suppose, with drive technologies. Part of our worldview is that humans are trusted and trusted agents to make good decisions. How do we make us, older generation, trust computers to either augment those decisions, to come up with options for solutions? When there are serious consequences on the lines, Josh and Andrew are dealing with professions that, you make a mistake on the battlefield and serious consequences occur. It's not like playing a game where there are no consequences. If you lose the Second World War, you don't really care. You just pack the game up and go away. Our technologies are preparing people to do potential things in real life. And I think that's a complex part of the wargaming and digital evolution of technology. We have to convince the senior leadership that the technologies are in fact delivering the level of assurance for application in the real world that they're seeking as we progress to them. I think it's great that, you know, as you get younger generations in who are more educated around digital systems particularly, and more trusting of the way the algorithms or the processes work, you can apply them more broadly. I think the stuff, you know, Josh is doing at the School of Signals is fantastic in immersing people in the environments where they may have to go, making those kind of decisions. How we do that with the paper-based, how you get into role-playing, you know, I suppose one of the things I was going to talk about was how, and Josh would know, being a role player, if you're playing in a fantasy environment and you're a role player, you very quickly get into character, whether your character's a wizard or a cleric or whatever it might be. When you're in the military or in the public service and you're trying to be an opponent, whatever the country that might be, and you're trying to get into that character to play it, that's really difficult. Understanding how other people think, understanding how they're going to work, understanding what capabilities they might apply to a problem is an area that role-playing at the moment is still difficult. But I think digital technology potentially can bring alive those opponents for us in a way that other humans who find it difficult to sit in someone else's shoes won't be able to do. So I think it's really optimistic, but there's a bit of cognitive bias that we have to overcome in some of our people.
Fair enough. Andrew, anything you would like to add to those marvellous comments made by everyone?
Yeah, look, probably just finishing off what Darren said there is, I guess, one area I really see an emerging technology that's going to help defence is AI. There are just so many areas that we're only just really touching on at the moment. That, you know, everything from, as I was just talking about before, generating characters through to, you know, more effective crowd behaviours. There are just so many areas and so many novel uses of AI. It's really just you know, something that we're exploring as much as we can at the moment.
Yes, and I know we've got quite a few different areas within defence focused on that AI space, and there's different reports and different strategies out in relation to AI for defence and its usage within that, because obviously that can be some touchy subjects as well, which is a whole nother panel. The final question that I wanted to ask everybody, and it's kind of a bit one to get off your chest maybe, is what stereotype would you like to address from a games in defence perspective? Like for me, you know, and kind of why the title of this panel is what it is that everyone just thinks that defence is just teaching people how to shoot. Obviously, I would like to think that over the last 55 minutes that we showcased that that's not the case, and that there's a lot of decision making that's outside of those aspects, and we're trying to use our tools to showcase that. But I'm sure there are some other potential stereotypes, or you can use the same one, it's up to you. But we'll start off with Todd. What's a stereotype you would like to address?
So there's two. So the first one is, for me, is the obvious one, that there is still amongst some people that perception that games are not serious. So, you know, that's just something that's bubbling below the surface. I think it's a lot less now than it was, and I don't think it was as bad as people have complained about it in the past either, but it is what it is. But for me, the most important one to overcome is the sense that you can just turn these things on. So we kind of get used to, you know, being able to turn on the computer and turn on a computer game and you just play it. Well, the sorts of games that we might use for experimentation are not really like that. You know, to design a scenario and a data capture plan and a data analysis plan that gets at the specific question that you want to ask actually takes a long time, weeks and months. And then to do the analysis takes weeks and months after that as well. So that's probably a big stereotype I want to try and educate people on, that you can't just unbox the game or, you know, turn on a computer or something and it just gives you an answer. There's a lot of preparation that goes into making one of these things credible.
Thank you. Darren, what would you like to try and address? What stereotype would you like to try and address?
Yeah, I'd certainly back up the games versus fun type thing. we play serious games, and that's hard to get your head around the two things. So play serious games. In that sense, they're not fun activities. They don't have to be boring, but they're not for fun. They're for real world outcomes. I think from that point of view, our games are not one-offs either. The idea that you can play a game and it will solve your problem for you, it will come up with the solution for you, I think is a dangerous idea, and is a stereotype we shouldn't have. Like, you know, we talk about in other games, a chess master is not someone who has played one game or read the book on how to play chess. It's someone who has played hundreds and hundreds of games and therefore deeply understands it. Like Todd, the idea that you create one game, it solves your problem, and then you move on to the next. Okay, that's not what we do. We have to play these games all the time. Maybe they're tweaked, the rules are changed, the scenario is slightly changed, but the more we play, the more we get out of our games.
Thank you, Darren. Andrew, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, look, just a couple of stereotypes. I guess as a developer, I'd just like to emphasize that, you know, our environment's not that different from a game development studio. We're using the same technologies and requirements and, you know, looking for the same skill set. So for young software developers out there, you know, defense is a viable, I guess, alternative to a game development studio. And not everything's about weapons and platforms either in defense. You know, we've got key areas of development and research, you know, things like human interactions and cognitive load that we work on. So yeah, I think someone else already covered that, but it's not about, you know, just weapons and platforms.
Alrighty, and I guess Josh, I'll leave you with the final stereotype that you would like to address.
Well, you know, people that play D&D aren't nerds. Let's get rid of that one right away. But just to follow on from what Darren was saying, you know, I think of serious games like a flight simulator. If a pilot can gain hours and hours of experience in a flight simulator and have that translate over to his job, then serious games should be looked upon with the same framework. Yes, the games are there for teaching discrete knowledge, but that experience is still valid. And just because it's a game, it shouldn't be discounted.
Nice one. Well, we've reached the time limit, so I'd like to thank everyone for coming along and being part of this panel today. Really appreciate it, and I hope that everyone in the audience who's watching this video today and in the future got a lot of information out of it in relation to how defence are looking at these type of technologies and these type of practices, and it's not just what everyone initially jumps to, that there are a wide, diverse array of technologies and practices going on that are using a lot of technologies, a lot of aspects that we see within a commercial space and beyond that. Again, I just want to put that the views that we've expressed here today are our own and not specifically those of defences unless that's been specifically stated. And apart from that, I hope everyone else enjoys the rest of PAX Aus 2021, and we hope to see everyone again in person in the year 2022. Thank you very much. See you all later.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you.